What you think about a person is only your point of view. Every day, you have a story about each one of your kids. Every day, you have a story about your spouse. Every day, you have a story about yourself. Every day, you have a story about your neighbor, about your boss, about your employee, about your coworker. You have stories about everyone. And I'm going to say more than half of that information in that story, you made up. You manufactured it. You made up the story. You probably had little bits of a story from your own personal experience, and then your brain naturally filled in the gaps with the rest of the details. But here's the thing you don't understand is that now that story you have of your child, of your spouse, of this other person, the story you have actually controls you. Stories in our mind become the control center of how we treat that person. I have watched mothers who treat their children differently. I've watched fathers treat their children differently. And when I see the father treat one of the children less than everybody else, less than, I, as their coach, will say, what's the story about that child? You treat them different. And they usually go, oh, if you only knew. I go, what's the story? Because you treat that child like they're almost nothing. Well, Kirk, that child is just so difficult. I'm like, okay. All right. Okay. Tell me why they're difficult. And then they tell me all these challenges and all these difficulties. And I go, is that the story of your child? Yeah, that's that child. And I said, well, how are you ever going to form a different opinion? And this is what I hear. Well, as soon as they behave better, I'll change my story about them. I said, really? You're going to treat this child like they're almost nothing, and you're waiting for them to behave better before you're going to treat them better? Well, yeah, why should I treat them better when they're like this? Wow. Now, I get it that they don't understand the power of psychology. They don't understand the power of the mind. They don't study psychology. I really wish that we as parents, because I'm a parent too, and when I was growing up as a parent, I made a lot of mistakes. And then I started studying, and then I corrected some of my mistakes, and I still got more to correct. So I'm human too. But really, every parent needs to study psychology. If you're a parent and you have kids, or you're going to have kids, pick up a book on psychology. Pick up a book on parenting, just so you can start to open your mind and not just let the story in your head decide how you're going to treat people. If you got a bad story about somebody, you literally are holding that person in that space. You are literally holding them there. They can't get out of your story because that's the story you have about them. It controls them because the way you talk to them, or the way you treat them, the way you behave around them, you keep putting them back into that particular spot. It's like when you go to a family reunion and you're back around your siblings and you're around your parents and your siblings. There's stories there. There's stories. And then people feel like they're being slid back into their old childhood stories in the family. And that can cause contention and awkwardness. And even when you're around your siblings, you take on your story of the role you played when you were growing up with your siblings. I mean, stories are powerful. I mean, they alter us. So part of the relationship blindness is that I find that I was blind to the power of my stories and what it was doing to me as I raised my kids. And I didn't figure it out until I'm halfway through raising my kids. I mean, I'm always raising my kids, but halfway through when they were growing up, I was like, oh man, I got some bad opinions here. And I'm affecting my kids. So my kids are older now, right? They don't live at home. They've moved out and they live in their own places, but I still have stories about them, even if they don't live here. Now, I'm happy to say a lot better story than where it used to be. A lot better. What I think about them, my opinion of them. And just to give you a little hint of the direction we're going here, is my opinion of my children is leading them to greatness. I don't have expectations of my kids. I have great opinions of my kids. And whenever I think of them, I think in those opinions. And I just think about what they're becoming. Because that's fair. We're all going somewhere. We're all growing. We're all learning. We're all making mistakes. And so if I can form an opinion about their becoming, like where they're going, and it's a very respectful story I have about them, but I do not expect them to live this story. I just like having that story. Because then the way I talk to them, the way I interact with them, the way I behave with them, the way I do anything with them, I treat them with so much more compassion, so much more love, so much more forgiveness, so much more understanding than where I used to be as a dad. And then even with my wife, my sweetie pie. I mean, spouses can make up stories about each other. And you unconsciously will start to treat them like the story you have in your mind. And if you've had difficulties with your spouse, that's in the story. If they have challenged you, or if they've just been just a tough person to live with, you've got stories. I remember teaching a class called Royalty and Romance, and this individual stood up and they said, I brought my spouse here so you could fix them. I said, oh, really? I said, what's your story about your spouse? And they go, oh, I'll tell you what my story is about my spouse. And they just ragged on their spouse for like 10 minutes. They just went off about all these things about their spouse and what they do wrong and how they do stuff. And I said to the person, I says, I'm so sorry to tell you this. Your spouse is never going to change. And they said, well, that's stupid. I came to your class so you could change them. I said, for you, your spouse will never change. I will see change, but you won't. And then they kind of got a little aggressive with me and they said, what do you mean I won't be able to see the change? And I said, there's nothing in your story that was merciful. There was nothing in your story of compassion. There was nothing of encouragement. And they just stood there looking at me. And then they kind of got it where they said, so you mean to tell me because the way I see my spouse, I won't see change? I said, yeah, you won't see it. Spouses cannot see change when their mind is so stuck on a story about them. You can't even see your kids change. You can't see your spouse change. You can't even see yourself change because your head is so stuck on the story you have about yourself, about them, about others. You don't realize the power that that story has on you. Like, it literally blinds you. It blinds you. I mean, story is powerful to help us change our life, but story can also be condemning, absolutely condemning to an individual. Whenever I meet somebody who's really heavy with feelings, and I'm going to say the word depression, they're really heavy with feelings and they have like no hope, they have nothing. I ask them, what's the story you have about yourself? And it's always terrible. It's just terrible. It's a terrible story about themselves. It's a terrible story about their life. It's terrible about their relationships. It's just terrible. And it just makes sense. If we have a terrible story, no wonder we feel hopeless. No wonder we feel heavy, because we feel trapped by the story. Stories can destroy us. Stories can destroy a marriage. Stories can cause your relationship with your children to completely be obliterated, and they never want to talk to you again. Stories can literally destroy your life. And also, a story can bring you together. A story can be healing. A story can be uniting. A story can be liberating. A story can be empowering. A story can be literally invigorating. It's one of the most powerful parts of psychology, is the story. It blows my mind. The more years that go by and I see the influence of how people are. And when I see somebody in a particular situation, I ask them, tell me your story. And then it makes sense. When I see somebody who's successful and I say, tell me your story, it makes sense why they're successful. When I see a marriage that is amazing and they're so dialed in and calibrated and balanced with each other, I go, tell me your story. And all you have to do is listen to a person's story, and it explains why they are where they're at. It's not that life gave them the story. Their story gives them life. So if you want to understand a little bit better about your relationships with people, you need to first evaluate the story you made up about them. And I'm going to say you made it up because it's got a bunch of pieces to it that are not correct. It's your own experience and opinion, but I can have my experience and my opinion too. You would have 100 different opinions about that person. So your opinion is not the end all opinion. It's not like you're all that and then some, like your stories are perfectly accurate. You've made up most of the story. You have some pieces and then you've filled it in with other things and formed a story. So here's the catch though. Here's the problem. Here's the challenge. We think the stories that we think about are true. But here's the truth. The stories we have are temporary. They're temporary. They're not the truth. Truth is still being unfolded. The story I have about my wife is temporary because every 5 minutes it could get better. Every 5 minutes it could get worse. But I'm going to be the author of the story, not my random thinking. I'm going to build stories about people that build people.